At this very moment, an emergency address by Volodymyr Zelensky is taking place. The president has announced the end of Putin's regime. Russia is capitulating. Secret documents straight from the desk of the Kremlin dictator. What is really happening inside Russia? Why has panic gripped the regions of the Federation? In addition, a peace agreement is already expected in September. But for now, a powerful strike of retribution. How did our drones paralyze 28 Russian regions? All the details right now. Greetings! This is the channel Ukraine Today, Andriy Silakov, and the latest events. Volodymyr Zelensky made an emergency and truly sensational statement, practically announcing the imminent collapse of Vladimir Putin's regime. The president of Ukraine has released exclusive intelligence data, secret reports, and confidential ratings that are being placed right now on the Kremlin dictator's desk. As Zelensky noted, Putin is rarely given truthful information without embellishment, as his subordinates fear the leader's wrath. But even the sanitized figures that reach his office point to an impending catastrophe for the Russian authorities.
In particular, the so-called projected indicators of Russians' dissatisfaction with Putin will continue to rise steadily, and he is already being conditioned to accept that this growing discontent cannot be stopped and that the numbers will not plateau by September, when parliamentary elections are scheduled in Russia.
According to intercepted documents, a social explosion is rapidly brewing inside Russia. The confidential projected indicators of Russians' dissatisfaction with Putin are steadily increasing. Moreover, analysts have already begun to gently accustom the dictator to the idea that it is impossible to stop this collapse in ratings, and that the situation will not stabilize or reach a plateau until September, when parliamentary elections are scheduled in the Russian Federation. At the same time, there is a total collapse in support for the ruling party, which will force the Kremlin to resort to unprecedented, massive falsifications in order to retain power.
As for the overall level of public support for the Russian ruling party, there is a consistent and noticeable downward trend, which means that substantially more extensive falsifications will be necessary. There is also a report of a significant increase in protest sentiment in the Russian regions. We believe that these reports have not yet taken into account the potential events of June, July, and August, which are bound to have an additional impact on the situation in Russia.
Also, according to the president, the pressure on the aggressor state will only increase, and by September, Putin will be facing absolutely catastrophic and dismal figures. That is precisely why the president of Ukraine made a historic statement, which sounds like a verdict for the Kremlin's master. Ukraine offered to negotiate a just peace, but in response, there were only threats of continued aggression. However, the real internal situation in the Russian Federation is screaming that Russia cannot withstand this war.
Consequently, by September, Putin will be facing even lower figures. Unfortunately, to all the public and private peace proposals we have made, the only response has been talk of continuing his war. The internal situation in Russia should convince them of the opposite, that peace is necessary. Ukraine is offering to negotiate a just peace. It is obvious that these trends will not change, and over time, this may mean that the agreement will have to be made with someone else in Russia, with someone who will not shut themselves off from reality.
And the president's words are consistent with his actions. The internal collapse of Russia is currently being accelerated by the brilliant work of the Ukrainian Defense Forces. Zelensky confirmed the successful implementation of the long-range sanctions plan in response to Moscow's refusal to end the war. Ukrainian soldiers delivered powerful strikes against important targets of the aggressor. In the Yaroslavl region, more than 700 kilometers from our border, the SBU Special Forces successfully struck a strategic oil reservoir. At the same time, the army reached as far as the Tula region, destroying the Azot plant, which is directly linked to the production of Russian explosives. The scale of Ukraine's response was unprecedented. In just one day, air raid sirens sounded in 28 regions of the Russian Federation, and emergency flight restrictions were imposed at 6 of Russia's largest airports. In addition, there were direct hits on the enemy's military logistics in the temporarily occupied territories. As Volodymyr Zelensky summarized, the logic is fair. The war inevitably returns to where it came from.
Ukraine is carrying out a plan of long-range sanctions against Russia and specific tasks involving medium and long-range strikes in response to Russia's refusal to end this war. We offered the Russian leadership every possible format for negotiations, but the only response was a continuation of aggression and attempts to expand it. It is logical that the war returns to where it came from. Ukraine needs peace.
And while the Putin regime is falling apart from within, international support for Ukraine is reaching an absolutely unprecedented historical level. The Asian giant has cast aside its former caution. How will Tokyo directly coordinate arms deliveries and the training of our fighters, finally burying the Kremlin's global ambitions? Find out in our report. Japan has struck Russia with full force. The giant of Asia has taken Ukraine's side. The country that Russian propaganda for years tried to portray as a cautious partner has shocked everyone with a demonstrative move. It is sending its military personnel for the first time to a NATO mission that is directly involved in supporting Ukraine. 4 members of the self-defense forces will be working in Wiesbaden, Germany. It is there that military aid to the Ukrainian armed forces is coordinated, Ukrainian soldiers are trained, and equipment is restored. What is especially unpleasant for Moscow is that the Japanese officers will not simply be observing from the sidelines. They will be studying modern combat tactics that have emerged on the battlefields of Ukraine. This creates a rather ironic situation. The Russian army is trying to impose its own lessons of war on the world, but in the end, a leading Asian nation comes to study how Ukrainian defenders are successfully breaking these methods. And this is only part of a much broader process. The Asian giant is increasingly supporting Ukraine. Tokyo is officially joining the Pearl program and allocating nearly $15 million for the purchase of American equipment for Ukraine. Formally, this concerns non-lethal equipment. However, the main point here is not the list of supplies, but the very fact itself. Japan is increasingly integrating itself into the system of international support for Kyiv and strengthening its cooperation with NATO. In Tokyo, they also openly speak about the need to bolster security due to threats from Russia and China. It is not surprising that the Kremlin has started to react nervously to Japan's rapprochement with the West, although it looks rather ironic. A country that for years has rattled its sabers at the borders of others is now outraged by its neighbors strengthening their own defenses. Meanwhile, the United States has sent Tokyo an unmistakably clear signal. In the event of a threat, Washington is prepared to use its full defensive capabilities, including its nuclear deterrent forces. Against the backdrop of increased military activity by Russia and China, this means one thing: Japan is receiving ever stronger security guarantees, while the Kremlin gets yet another proof that its actions only serve to strengthen the coalition of countries ready to jointly contain Russian ambitions. It's no time for Putin to relax, as Japan has once again reminded everyone that it does not renounce its claims to the so-called northern territories and continues to demand a resolution to the long-standing dispute over the Kuril Islands.
Relations between Japan and Russia are complicated, but our determination to resolve the issue of the 4 northern islands and to conclude a peace treaty remains unchanged.
And now it seems people in Moscow have started to get noticeably nervous. Putin's aide, Nikolai Patrushev, has essentially accused Japan of preparing new territorial claims and has even perceived a threat to Russian security. According to him, Tokyo is allegedly not interested in historical justice, but rather in the resources of the Kuril Islands and the surrounding seas. It turns out to be rather amusing. If the islands, as the Kremlin insists, are definitively and irrevocably Russian, then why such a nervous reaction to every statement from Tokyo?
Japan is actively establishing the strategic groundwork for new territorial claims that have a direct and significant impact on Russia's sovereign national security interests.
The most interesting thing is that Russian officials simultaneously claim to have full control over the islands, while at the same time frightening citizens with the mighty Japanese fleet and Tokyo's growing closeness with NATO. It gives the impression that the Kremlin is increasingly concerned not so much about the Kurils themselves, but about Japan rapidly strengthening its position in the region. Meanwhile, Russia is forced to spread its resources thin because of the protracted war. At the same time, Japan itself is actively preparing for possible challenges. In Tokyo, there is growing concern about the increase in Russian military activity in the Far East. During his visit to Hokkaido, Defense Minister Shinjiro Koizumi stated directly that protecting the northern borders remains one of the country's top priorities.
Even despite the growing importance of strengthening the defense of the southwestern regions, Hokkaido remains a region of vital importance. It is necessary to continue maintaining a flawless defense system here.
Moscow is now effectively turning the Sea of Okhotsk into a protected base for its nuclear submarines. At the same time, Russia is increasing its military presence on the disputed islands near Hokkaido, where Su-35 fighter jets and anti-ship missile systems have already been deployed. In other words, the Kremlin continues to militarize a region that Japan considers directly linked to its national security. The irony is that through its actions, the Kremlin is achieving the exact opposite of its intended result. The more actively Moscow rattles its sabers near Japan's borders, the faster Tokyo increases its defense spending, deepens cooperation with NATO, and supports Ukraine. It seems that the Russian leadership has become so carried away with creating new adversaries that now even one of the most cautious countries in Asia increasingly sees Russia not as a neighbor, but as a potential threat. There is no way back now. The samurai has drawn his sword, and all that remains for the Kremlin now is to pray. And while Asian giants like Japan openly take Ukraine's side, the so-called main ally of the Kremlin is already preparing to devour a weakening Russia from within. The show about a friendship without limits has finally turned into a one-sided game. Moscow is giving away its resources and sovereignty to Beijing for next to nothing. Why are they already openly discussing the future of Russian territories in China itself? And what scenarios for absorbing Russia are they actively calculating there? We'll tell you right now.
China is devouring Russia. Quietly, without unnecessary words, Xi Jinping is taking territories while Putin gladly hands them over and bows at his feet. Beijing is turning the Far East and Siberia into a raw materials appendage with a long-term Chinese contract. A vivid example is the Zashulanskoye coal deposit in the Trans-Baikal region, which is being developed jointly by Russian and Chinese companies. The project is planned to last for centuries of extraction, and the Russian side is also generously handing out tax breaks. In fact, it looks like a long-term lease of the region in exchange for investment, with Beijing becoming the main beneficiary. Starting from 2027, they plan to send about 5 million tons of coal to China from here every year. That's hundreds of trucks every day. New routes are being laid literally through forests near mineral water sources and protected natural areas. Ecology, it seems, is a secondary detail in this scheme, simply left out of the business plan. In parallel with resources, China is actively entering the regions through people and business. In the Baikal region, tourist infrastructure catering to Chinese visitors is growing. Investors are buying up land and building hotels, pushing out local entrepreneurs. According to various estimates, there may already be up to 2 million Chinese citizens in the Far East. Against this backdrop, it looks less and less like a partnership and more like a gradual economic reprogramming of the region to suit Beijing's interests. And while Russia is gradually turning into a resource periphery for China, even harsher scenarios are emerging in the Chinese information space, not about cooperation, but about the actual division of Russian territories in the event of a crisis. And strangely enough, this is presented not as a fantasy, but as a geopolitical calculation. A piece appeared in the Chinese media that openly discusses the potential control over 7 million square kilometers of Russia's Far East in the event of an internal collapse of the Russian Federation. The authors refer to the fact that, due to the war against Ukraine, Russian forces have been redeployed to the west, leaving the eastern regions virtually empty, with minimal military presence and weak control over the territory. The economic conclusion is even harsher. According to the authors, Russia is rapidly deteriorating and its economy is allegedly smaller than that of a single Chinese province. And here, cold logic comes into play. If the center of the Russian Federation weakens, the Far East with its resources should not go to waste. At the same time, the authors cautiously warn Beijing against direct military expansion, hinting at a scenario of international isolation similar to the situation surrounding Crimea. Instead, another approach is proposed. A soft absorption through investments, long-term contracts, and support for friendly forces in the region, which formally retain their independence, but in reality become dependent on China. In fact, the main idea expressed in the text is that Russia no longer appears capable of fully controlling its own eastern territories, and China, taking advantage of the moment, can gradually fill this vacuum of influence. And even if all this is presented as analysis, the very appearance of such scenarios in the public sphere looks like a signal. Beijing is already thinking in terms of the post-Russia era.
The collapse of Russia is no joke. Only through careful preparation can one move forward calmly.
And perhaps the Celestial Empire will not wait for the collapse of the Russian Federation, but will start speaking the language of force. China is building a gigantic military mega-complex in the desert, so massive that Western analysts are already openly saying they've never seen anything like it before. We are talking about a new strategic zone near the intercontinental nuclear missile silos, where, according to Reuters, more than 80 launch pads, a bunker, a railway junction, airfields, and command centers are being built. Essentially, a fully fledged military fortress of the future. Of particular concern are 3 gigantic octagonal complexes surrounded by fortifications and protected infrastructure. Experts suggest that these may house electronic warfare systems, command centers, or elements of nuclear infrastructure, including the preparation and deployment of mobile missile systems. But the key detail is that no one knows for sure what exactly is inside. And it is precisely this uncertainty that frightens analysts the most. In fact, this is an unprecedented expansion of China's nuclear architecture amid escalating tensions with the United States, especially around Taiwan. What is emerging in the desert is not just a military base, but a new level of strategic reality, where Beijing is demonstrating its readiness to play the long game. And while the world tries to comprehend the scale of what it has seen, experts admit they have never recorded this level of military construction in the era of nuclear states. For Putin, this is a real geopolitical cold shower. Russia is looking less and less like an independent center of power and more like a resource periphery in China's orbit. The Middle Kingdom is not acting abruptly, for now. But it seems that Putin may live to see the day when Xi Jinping takes what he wants quickly and without warning.
And while Beijing cynically prepares to swallow a weakening Russia from the east, the West is launching a powerful diplomatic offensive. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz announced that the window for negotiations will open soon, and the ambassadors of the European trio have already presented the Kremlin with a tough and unified position directly. Find out next on what terms the European Union and the United States are ready to end this war.
The escalation in the Middle East and Russia's war against Ukraine will be key topics of discussion at the G7 summit, which will take place in France from June 15th to 17th, Reuters reports. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will take part in the talks in Evian-les-Bains, Emmanuel Macron announced.
First, there will be a meeting of the 7 leaders to discuss the main topics of international crises. Then, on Tuesday morning, we will hold a discussion on Ukraine with President Zelensky. And this is very important for us because we need to restore consensus within the G7 regarding support for Ukraine on various aspects.
European leaders emphasize it is Moscow, not Kyiv, that is blocking the diplomatic process. And since negotiations to end the war have reached a deadlock, Ukraine is seeking to give them new momentum. And Europe can play a major role in this, President Volodymyr Zelensky is convinced.
The main thing is that today it is very important to prepare for those negotiations and decisions that we are all eagerly awaiting from the summits at the level of the European Union, the Group of 7 and NATO. June and July of this year could decide a great deal.
At the summit in France, European leaders will try to involve Trump in discussing an initiative for new peace talks between Ukraine and Russia, Bloomberg predicts. Kyiv's partners believe that the dynamics of the war have changed and Ukraine's position has strengthened. Russia, on the other hand, is unable to achieve significant successes on the battlefield. All this, according to analysts, creates opportunities for the resumption of diplomacy. However, so far there are no signs that Moscow is ready to end the war against Ukraine, noted European Commission spokesperson Anita Hipper. Negotiations are taking place in various formats in different locations and at different levels, involving heads of state, governments, ministers, high-ranking diplomats and officials from our side. You are well aware of our position. We want peace. Ukraine wants peace, and that is why we are now doing our utmost to convince Russia of the need for a genuine, long-term and just peace. At present, we do not see any signs of this. That is precisely why we are constantly maintaining stability, including with regard to the recently adopted sanctions package, which provides for additional sanctions against Russia. The leaders of the United Kingdom, Germany and France want Russia to agree to an immediate ceasefire, using the current front line as a starting point for negotiations. It is also extremely important from the perspective of Kyiv's partners to provide Ukraine with reliable security guarantees. The European leaders presented their proposals in a joint statement after negotiations in London. And on June 11th, the ambassadors of the United Kingdom, Germany and France conveyed the contents of this document to the Deputy Foreign Minister of the Federation, Mikhail Galuzin.
International borders must not be changed by force. Russian assets will remain immobilized until Russia ends its aggressive war and pays Ukraine compensation for the damage caused by the war. It is also necessary to ensure the protection of European security interests in any agreement. From the joint statement of Volodymyr Zelensky, Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron and Friedrich Merz on the website of the UK government.
The successful achievement of a just and lasting peace between Ukraine and Russia is an absolutely essential and fundamental requirement for guaranteeing and maintaining long-term security in the Black Sea region, stated and emphasized by Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan.
We consider it vital for peace and stability in our region to use every opportunity to achieve peace between Russia and Ukraine. Turkey will continue to actively support both sides in this direction. We expect the swift achievement of a lasting and just peace based on international law.
The Kremlin's calculations that prolonging the war would lead Europe to withdraw its support for Kyiv have not come true. Ukraine has received the 7th tranche of funding from the European Union under the Ukraine facility, amounting to €2.8 billion. The European Union has also agreed on large-scale defense and budget assistance programs for the coming years, and Kyiv continues to work with partners to expand defense cooperation. Natalia Husok for Freedom TV channel.
And what do you think about these events? Share your opinion in the comments, leave a like and stay up to date with the main news. There's more to come.